Hello, Eldar.
Hi, Glenn.
Hi, this is Glenn Loury of Brown University and bloggingheads.tv, and we're here at the Glenn Show talking with Eldar Shafir, who is professor of psychology at Princeton University, and whose new book with the economist Sindel Mullainathan, Scarcity, Why Having Too Little Means So Much. I'm holding your book up in front of the camera right now, Eldar. We're here to talk about this book, its reception, what the argument is, what the larger project is, about your collaboration with this economist up at Harvard, and all of that. So I really appreciate that you're willing to spend some time with us. Hello, Eldar. Are you there?
I just lost hearing you, but I'm back. Yes, I hear you now.
Okay. So I did an intro just now, if you didn't hear all of it, and
Okay.
I didn't say anything substantive. I just said who you are and why we're here to talk. And I mentioned the book,
Yeah.
and it was reviewed a couple of weeks ago in the New York Review of Books. I thought very favorably. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And wanted to share with our audience, some of what it is that you and your co-author, the economist Sindel Mullainathan, uh, are up to in this book, and wonder if we could start out just by you summarizing a bit the argument of the book.
Sure. So, we started by really being interested in issues of poverty. In particular, Stendhal had been doing a lot of work in development economics, and I was doing work on behavioral decision making. And then we realized that very little had been done studying the behaviors of people in context of poverty. So we started looking at that. It's been a few years. Our perspective shifted with time. And we ended up with a story that basically says that when you put people in conditions of scarcity, particularly money, because we're interested in the poor, but it's also true about scarcity in time if you're busy, or of calories if you're dieting. If you put people in context of scarcity, that scarcity captures a lot of their attention. There's basically a psychology of scarcity that emerges when people are deep in conditions of scarcity. And once they're there, they tend to spend a lot of time attending to managing that scarcity and a lot less time to other issues that are the periphery. And that yields a particular set of behaviors and a psychology that is what we describe in the book.
A psychology of scarcity.
Yeah. It's a
These are,
mindset that
yeah,
scarcity brings about.
I see. So I noticed in reading the book that you acknowledge right at the onset that you're not saying, as you make these observations of similarity or commonality of psychological process across different venues. Poor people don't have enough money, busy people don't have enough time, obese people don't have enough calories, etc. Lonely people don't have enough company. These are all very different settings of social behavior in which the actor, the subject, doesn't have enough of something that they value. And your theory of scarcity is meant to, is it not, identify common behavioral tendencies or orientations that individuals will incline to that are common across these different venues. But you guys are careful to emphasize that in doing so, you're not saying that these are the same problems or that there are not other and very significant factors that might be involved in, the different situations that you could point to.
Indeed, indeed. So, when we talk about, for example, scarcity in social connections, if you think about people who are lonely, it's not clear exactly what it would look like to save some of that for later. If you look at scarcity of time, it's not clear exactly, how you would save time for later. Time tends to pass. Whereas in some areas, in the case of poverty, borrowing is a massive, massive phenomenon of great importance. And again, not clear how you would borrow, for example, social connections. So there are many features to these that differ from one to the other, but we argue there's a certain psychological phenomena, the attention that's devoted on scarcity at the expense of other things, that seems to be common to many of these. To different
Can
fields.
you take a moment? Can you take a moment then to describe what you guys are identifying as the sort of core uh, elements of human behavior that manifest themselves particularly in circumstances of scarcity, and what the evidence is that you point to support your generalizations.
Yeah, so the main thing is that when you inhabit scarcity, it captures your attention in ways that, in some cases you might choose to do, in other cases are quite automatic. You almost can't control it. We describe a really quite touching episode in the 40s when they were studying what happens to people who are starving and how to feed them back into health. And they describe these healthy young men who volunteered to be part of the study. These are conscientious objectors during the good war.
Yeah.
And they describe them, and these guys, talented, wonderful guys, they just can't think of anything but food. They spend a lot of time planning to become restaurateurs. They study recipes. It's, comical part of the time and less comical in other times, but they can think of nothing else but food. And, use it as an opening story. But basically the argument is that when you experience, for example, financial scarcity, a lot of your time is spent focusing on finances. And we even describe studies where you can literally do in computer-based cognitive tasks, you can actually show how certain words are salient in people's minds. When you're thirsty, you identify thirst-related words like water and thirst, and drinking faster, then you would identify words that are neutral, as compared to a control group of subjects who identify other words just as fast as you, but they're slower at thirst-related words. So the argument is that when you experience scarcity, the related concepts are salient. They capture your attention. We have relatively limited cognitive capacity, limited bandwidth, limited attention. And as a lot of it is captured by the stuff you don't have enough of, there's just less of other things. And you end up not just focusing on it, you end up what we call tunneling. You focus so much, this is a classic metaphor from visual attention, that things in the periphery just get blurry, they just get less attention. And sometimes things in the periphery are relatively important to the thing you're doing. So when you focus heavily on finances, things like, the interest rate 2 weeks from now, what might be relatively blurry. So as you're focusing on putting out a fire right now, you reach for that, interest, for that payday loan bucket to put out the fire. You don't stop to ask, how much is that bucket going to cost me 2 weeks from now? And so that focus leads you to neglect other things, often important things that are in the periphery, and in many cases, at a high cost.
Yeah. Now, okay, so it sounds to me like there is a core scarcity that's implicated in all of the other peripheral scarcities, and that's the scarcity of cognitive attention that the human mind is capable of mustering. We can only, and I speak as a very, very amateur psychologist, we can only attend to so many things, and the condition of feeling a severe lack of something that we value or that is important influences how our minds allocate this limited resource, which is our capacity to attend, and that's kind of what you're talking about. Is that, did what I say make any sense at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one thing that's been known in the cognitive sciences for the last 3 or 4 decades is the remarkable limit on on the tunnel of our attention, how much we can attend to at one time. The recent application to that would have been if you follow the literature on the use of cell phones in cars. I mean, it's kind of amazing. I mean, just using a cell phone in the car, forget using your hands, just a non-hand cell phone. That leads people to exhibit reaction times and peripheral ability to detect that compares roughly to being legally drunk. I mean, we just have things over the last 3 or 4 decades have made it very clear that we have a very limited capacity of which we're often not aware. It's hard for us to appreciate it. We don't often feel it, despite the fact that we show these very strong, diminishing of capacity. And so in the book, Sano and I basically rely on this very well-accepted and well-documented set of findings about limited bandwidth, limited cognitive capacity, and argue that, managing scarcity is a lot worse than using a cell phone in the car. It captures a lot of your attention and leaves too little for other things.
Okay, so now this is a new observation, is it? Sorry to ask the academic's question, but it seems a very commonsensical thing to observe that people have limited cognitive resources, and that if they're hard-pressed, their minds will be disproportionately occupied with the thing that they do not have enough of. Where is the breakthrough here? And again, I say that humbly.
I'm with you. I'm with you. I mean, in fact, I think in some interesting way we've had some remarkable results, which, required no special technology, no new applications. It's really quite straightforward, and I agree with you. It's kind of marveling, and I was marveling at that too. I think part of what happened is that, to me, this is kind of a victory of behavioral economics. It's a victory of economists and behavioral scientists getting together to do work. I think for a long time, economists have been working on issues that have to do with poverty, but not really bringing in classic cognitive psychological assumptions. And behavioral scientists haven't really involved themselves much in work on poverty. And so this is a case where you bring the two disciplines, kind of a look at poverty with instruments that are brought by and insights that's delivered by cognitive science, along with economists' understanding of the context of poverty. And together we seem to have gotten something that I agree with you, in some sense, a relatively trivial application. All we did in the world of scarcity is what's been done for a long time in the world of cockpit design. It's not that different.
So, what would be a way of thinking about poverty that had been typical of economics or economics and sociology and social psychology and so forth, which once one takes on board the fact of scarcity having its seizing of our minds as it does, once one takes that on board, one would think differently about this or that aspect of the behavior of the poor. I mean, where had the analyses of these situations gone wrong or come up short prior to taking into account the set of things that you and Senthil are interested in your book?
Well, I think the two guiding frameworks all along have been either the one that was heavily proposed by, rational choice analyses that assume that the poor are sort of doing the best cost and benefits available to them given their circumstances. And so if you, altered taxation and benefits in certain ways, they acted accordingly.
Yeah.
And on the other side, some sort of a culture of poverty, pathology, myopia, lack of understanding analysis that suggested the poor are just doing things badly because they don't understand. And, I think we're proposing a somewhat a very different account, which is really about the impact that the context of inhabiting scarcity has on your function. So as a result, the behaviors you exhibit need not be a result of lack of understanding or myopia of any sort, nor do they have to be perfectly calculating. They're the behaviors of somebody who has limited bandwidth that's been imposed on and neglects a lot of things in the periphery. So the kind of classic studies that we describe, or we do, these studies in the malls that you read about, we go to people, we give them financial scenarios to think about, and we'll give them classic cognitive tests, of cognitive control tests of how well you divide your attention and you resist impulse in your responses, as well as fluid intelligence, the components of IQ tests. And we showed that when we looked at poor people in the mall, who are just as good as the rich when they're not distracted by financial scenarios, once you put them in a context that grabs a lot of their bandwidth as they're struggling with certain financial concerns, they now do substantially less well on these cognitive tests. So these are people who are just as capable when the financial world does not intrude in their thinking, and now perform substantially less well once their bandwidth is taken with their budgetary concerns.
Let me see if I'm following this. So if I were to observe in a population of poor or people systematically different behaviors along certain dimensions, their kids may do less well in school. They may not measure up as well as attentive parents. They may more often be engaged in law breaking. They may their relationships may not be as stable. I don't assert that these things are fact. I only offer hypothetically. Suppose I were to observe this, then you guys are coming along and saying, well, to the extent that the data bear out such generalizations about differences between the poor and others in their patterns of behavior, one important source of those differences is the fact of their poverty itself, because that fact, that overarching scarcity, alters their cognitive processes, their decision making, the choices that they're making, their capacities to function in certain environments and at certain tasks, alters it, diminishes it in ways that could account for performance differences between the poor and the non-poor.
Yeah, I think that's very well put, and that's I think what we would say. So, Take for example bad parenting, which is a lot of people have claimed that the poor attend to their kids less, they spend less
Yep.
time, they're less consistent in their disciplining. There's an old study that Rapetti and her colleagues where they sit, these sociologists sit in your living room for days and days
Yeah.
on end and look at how you interact with your family, and they do this with air
Right.
traffic controllers, and it's a nice group because these are people who have bad days and good days almost at random depending on weather and traffic, and whose days you can kind of gauge almost objectively. You can look at how many planes they kept in the air that day. And what you find is that these air traffic controllers are better parents and more attentive spouses at the end of easy days as opposed to bad days, difficult days. And yes, what we're arguing is that the poor maintain a lot of planes in the air. And so a lot of what you're finding is really the outcome of just juggling a lot and having too little left to manage other things you want to do well.
There's a sociologist at the University of Wisconsin, a young sociologist named Alice Goffman. And I don't know if you've come across her work. She's an ethnographer who has, amongst other things, she's young. I don't know that she's 30 years old yet, but she's done some really interesting work. And one of the things she did was sit for the better part of a year amongst low-income people in the city of Detroit to study the implications of food insecurity, not having enough to eat. Okay. This is scarcity of calories of a different sort than the obesity example that you guys give in the book. This is, enforced scarcity of calories because there just aren't enough calories to go around. People existing on 13 or 1,400 calories a day, she's estimating. And she talks about, how a mother will be lethargic through the day because she hasn't got enough to eat, and how she'll be obsessed with having something for her children when they come home from school, so that the children can have enough energy to do their homework that day, and things of this kind. And I just imagine that her subject's complete existence can come to be, and she describes it so, dominated by this idea of where the next meal is going to come from. I offer that as a just ad hoc example, but it came to mind as you were describing what you guys are doing.
I think that's totally right. And, if we end up talking a bit about, policy implications and how to do it, to follow up on exactly what you're describing, just take, management of childcare and work. If you're a single mother in inner city America who is told by her boss, 2 days in advance what hours you work on Thursday, and then has to run around and manage childcare for the kids that day 48 hours from now. If you do that every day, you're basically spending all your cognitive capacity managing your children. You're not going to have enough time to worry about eating healthy or saving for retirement or anything else. And, this is a place where I think even simple 7 to 7 childcare, which, some countries provide better than us, could make a big difference, give you a bandwidth gift.
Okay, so, no, this seems like a really important potential alteration of the way we think about social policy, to observe that, hey, don't be so hard on the poor. The patterns of behavior that you're seeing are endogenous. They are the product, at least to some considerable degree, a degree which we could presumably assess experimentally or observationally in terms of, contrasting people's behaviors across different situations of differently tight constraint. Their behavior is under the influence of these processes triggered by scarcity. And so when we're thinking about the formulation of policy, we might want to take that into account. For example, the benefits from relieving some of these scarcity constraints might not only be captured in the area where the constraint is relieved. That is to say, if I get more calories to the family, or if I get a little bit more money, I might be able to say that, child health outcomes will be better, or there will be some cognitive benefit from more calorie or more money. The benefits there could be a multiplier effect to the benefits of relieving these constraints, because once I relieve the constraint, I free up, capacity, bandwidth, as you're calling it, that the person who is constrained can then allocate beneficially in other areas of their lives.
Exactly, and I think that's it's a profound point that it took me a while to see that come out of this work. Typically in policy circles, if I help you with your banking, I give you I make you banked, and I give you some automatic deposits. I then go and see how well that worked by seeing how well you're doing financially. It never occurs to us to help you in banking and then see whether you're eating better or adhering to your drug regimen better or being a better parent. And as you're saying, what comes out of this work is, I have a single bandwidth that I use to do my banking and being a patient parent and remembering to take my medication. And once you liberate some of that, I might devote the resulting bandwidth gift in any area aspect of my life where it might be the most important. So, like you said, you might helping with budgeting and find that I've become a more attentive parent as a result.
Yeah. Now, what about paternalism? What about the idea that if I think that people under situations of severe scarcity are going to be impaired cognitively in a particular way, and that they'll make decisions that might not, on reflection, be from their own point of view of evaluation of their interest in their interest, then perhaps they oughtn't to be left with the discretion that they wouldn't be able to effectively deploy under their conditions of severe constraint. Perhaps we ought to, I'm searching in my mind for a good example. One doesn't occur to me. Make some of those decisions for them. I mean, for example, food stamps. Maybe this is a poor example. We want to give supplement the resources available to families that don't have enough money. And one of the things we want them to do is to be able to better feed their children. And crudely put, we could either give them cash or we could give them something that is dedicated and they can only use for food, or we could even restrict it further and say they can only use it for, fresh vegetables and whatnot, and they can't use it for starchy or sugary or alcohol or anything like that. And so we're being paternalistic, and a kind of typical liberal with the small L response to that would be, hey, man, people know what's best for themselves, but, well, no. Under conditions of scarcity, perhaps they don't, quote, know what's best for themselves, close quote. And perhaps we're justified, even again, in terms of their own, considered interest in restricting their liberties or making some of those decisions for them. I'm really asking you what you think about that, and if that's at all a fair extrapolation from what it is you're finding in the study of scarcity.
I think it is a fair extrapolation. I would take it further and say I think that's true about most of us. There's probably some interesting distinctions that we would need to worry about, but on the whole, to a large extent, you are time scarce or experiencing time scarcity, you're time poor, in ways that are not totally dissimilar from the way that these subjects you're describing are money poor. And, that has similar consequences. So, probably the most a celebrated example of some form of benign paternalism has to do with, defaulting people into retirement savings. And, you have a biased sample. You're in an economics department, but if I can tell you about my colleagues around here, none of them know what 401k looks like, how it works. They've never spent more than 5 minutes planning for how to do it exactly when they retire. They're busy, publishing papers. And they need some paternalistic help, either from their employer or from the government or somebody to help them to manage their retirement better, because that's the most important thing they'll do financially. So, yeah, I'm with you. I mean, those of us who come from a behavioral economics perspective have come to accept, with all the necessary provisos about doing it carefully and not losing control, that some paternalism done, with good taste probably is very beneficial for people, the poor included.
So, okay, I want to talk politics for a minute.
Well,
in the following sense, No, I encountered the concept of the scarcity trap, reading through some of the early pages of your book. The scarcity trap, correct me if I get this wrong, is that, okay, the first order observation is that scarcity focuses or captures the mind because of limited cognitive resources. Individuals who are confronted with a severe lack of something of great value to themselves will focus a great deal of their attentions on that fact, and they will tunnel, and they will be restricted, as you were just saying just moments ago, in the range of their attention. And that will affect their behavior. And some of the behaviors that it affects may actually feed back to reinforce their poverty. If they're late paying their bill, then they have to pay the late fee. If they wait to the last minute and then go and borrow from a high interest rate person on the corner, payday lender or something like that, then that just leaves less resources for them to spend on the paying off their bills, because they have to pay the interest on that, and they get into a debt trap and things of this sort. So their poverty may in part be due to their behavior, which reinforces their poverty, but which is accounted for by the fact of their poverty. Something like that. So do I describe the concept of scarcity trap correctly?
Yeah, yeah, indeed. And as you recall, we did a very careful study with Princeton undergraduates. I love it because it really captures very nicely. We put these undergraduates in a lab setting. We'll make them poor and rich in time, not in money. But, to make the story short, basically we show that when you give them the equivalent of a payday loan, they can have extra seconds to play the game, which they can borrow at high interest and a few extra seconds. And, they get paid for how well they do. And the subjects, the kids, the Princeton undergraduates who have enough time are very careful not to take these very high interest loans, and they stick with the time they got, and they do fairly well. When you make them poor enough in time, they end up dying to have 2 or 3 more seconds to do well. They grab these high interest seconds loans and end up running out of time way too quickly and leaving their life with less money than had they not been able to borrow. So it's a classic case with the same sophisticated subjects. When they had enough, were wise enough to avoid the payday loan. Once they have too little, they grab it and they get into a poverty trap and run out of time and destroy their performance.
Yeah, a time poverty trap. I thought that the experimental design was very clever of how you could elicit this seemingly irrational, or at least, sort of, I don't know, intertemporally inconsistent or something kind of behavior from people borrowing time at extraordinarily high interest rates because of the fact that they get into a tight spot. But the political aspect of what I was going to call attention to, or, quasi-political, is, all right, so it's one thing to observe that behavior is altered by the fact of limited resources, and in fact that altered behavior might reinforce the person's impoverished state. It's another thing to talk about what to do about poverty, which, if we were to have different institutions or different social commitments, people wouldn't so often be in these circumstances of scarcity. And the effects on their behavior that may reinforce their poverty would be of second order significance relative to the first order issue of, do we have a set of institutions or a set of social norms that bind us together in such a way that we don't allow mothers in inner city Detroit to have to worry about whether there will be enough calories for their kids to pay attention when they come home. True, if the mothers are pressed like that, they're going to do all kinds of things, and we can study them. But the main order of business here ought to be seeing that mothers are not so pressed in the first place. Does that seem unfair as a statement to make after someone has read your book?
No, I think I take it further. I think it puts a real onus on policymakers to realize, and all of us, that if you take this story seriously, we have an enormous obligation to design a cockpit, a context that allows the person to thrive given the pressures are under. And for me, the payday loan is still the best example. As I'm functioning under very limited, constrained bandwidth limitations, I'm spending a lot of time focusing on this problem I have. I lose focus of the periphery. It's fuzzy. And now it's up to you. Either you leave landmines in the periphery that I not notice and I step on, like payday loans, or you design a periphery that's a little bit more benign and allows me to navigate without being hurt. And I think this is a place where we have done a very poor job designing a context for those who are bound to exhibit occasional scarcity-induced failures to be able to recover rather than sink lower.
I wonder, this is shifting the subject slightly, but if this is, I jotted a note to myself as I was reading, if it's all in our minds, can we talk people out of feeling poor? Okay, which is to say, can one envision a therapeutic practice in which the point of the enterprise is to disabuse people of these tunneling and sort of distorted attention practices that they might lapse into? Let's stay with the time budget constraint. Okay, so I'm overcommitted. All right, and I'm worried about it. I'm sweating it. Rather than taking one day at a time, making sure that every 24 hours gets spent productively, what I can't do today, I'll take care of tomorrow, one day at a time, which is what they teach you when you're trying to not use cocaine or alcohol, as I recall. In other words, rather than living and let living, rather than having a kind of laid back, meditative sensibility, I'm anxious, I'm driven, I'm all aflutter because I don't have enough time to do my things. Well, can we talk people out of Uh, is it
Yeah, yeah.
crazy to think about intervening in that way?
No, there is an extreme, obviously. There's extreme at some level. I don't know exactly how to define it, but there is a point in living in poverty that's such extreme poverty that discussing about having any more modest taste does just is just bad taste. It doesn't work anymore. So if I'm barely feeding my children, you can't give me lectures about time I want less. But up to that point, I think you're totally right. Certainly about time and also about money. We use this suitcase metaphor where you have a budget and you can either pack your suitcase tighter or less tight. And in that metaphor, there's two solutions. Capitalism says to you, get yourself a bigger suitcase. And, the Zen view of the world says, want fewer things. And either way,
Exactly.
whether you get a bigger suitcase or want fewer things, in both cases, you will have more space, more slack in your suitcase, and life will become easier and more pleasant. And so, yes, I think time is a beautiful example you raised because in many ways, time scarcity looks a lot like money scarcity in the sense that you have to devote so much attention and you're overwhelmed by it. But of course, the big difference is that for most of us who are time scarce, this is a discretionary choice we've made. It's a little bit comical between us because if we stop taking ourselves so seriously, if we miss the deadlines and miss all the things we need to do, absolutely nothing would happen. So the whole thing is a little bit artificial. But clearly, if we were less hungry to achieve and did fewer things, we would have more time to play with our children and more time to relax and enjoy flowers and the grass. So that's certainly true. But when it comes to finances, it is a similar story, no doubt. A lot of people who are living a very good life are stressed for money because they have developed a certain quality of life, or financial difficulties, the recession, cause you to have to worry about whether you're going to be able to continue affording the $1 million a year golf membership where all your social life depends. So then you get into these complications that are obviously of the kind that you can develop more modesty about and want less. So that's right.
Okay.
But again, we
Okay.
have to keep in mind, obviously, that when you get to a certain level of poverty where you just can't afford the minimum that's considered acceptable in a place and time in which you live, then in those cases, lecturing you about wanting less becomes, not a very nice or wise or, for that matter, ethical solution.
Yeah. So you're working with an economist, and you guys have been working together for some years now. What's that like? I mean, are we speaking? I'm an economist. You're a psychologist. Are we speaking in some at some level of generality the same language? Are there miscues and lost in translation kind of things that go on between an economist and a psychologist when they get down to brass tacks about designing experiments and interpreting their findings and such?
Uh,
How's it work?
Well, Sendel is not your typical economist, no doubt. I mean, he's, behaviorally very astute and well trained. There are obviously interdisciplinary conversations. There are things that to each of us look a little bit silly from the other side, and then there's an enormous amount that you learn. So, to a large extent, I certainly believe that both disciplines bring a lot of wisdom and a certain blind spots. And so you kind of, I think to a large extent, what we managed to do here is sort of inform each other, inform the two disciplines, and hopefully get the best of both. I think if you look at collaborations between psychologists and economists throughout the time, there have certainly been cases where the differences were bigger and where there's less of an understanding of each other's side, so there was really more of a tension. In this particular collaboration, I think we are both fairly well informed of the relevant literature and how to think about it, so that the conversation and the collaboration end up being very much mutually enriching. There's very few real abysses that we've noticed anywhere.
Well, from a conventional economist perspective, your enterprise, your project, you and Sendel's program might seem threatening. I mean, first of all, you're going to the core of the kind of rationality assumption people are acting. The way I want to think as an economist about the behavior of people that I'm studying is that they have some criteria of judgment about which states of affairs are better for them. They have some technical means of making choices which will then influence the resulting state of affairs, and that the choices that they will be observed to make will be to their best calculation the choices which through that technical mechanism results in, from their point of view, given their information and so forth, the best outcome possible for them according to their criteria of assessing alternatives. And that whole edifice seems like you're down there at the cornerstone pulling it out and trying to kick away the stilts that are holding the thing up, and the whole thing's going to fall down.
No, hopefully not the whole thing. I think it will have to be slightly revised. You have to do some, reconstruction on the edges. When I used to work with Amos Tversky, he used to joke that it's very hard to explain something to somebody when his livelihood depends on not getting it. But I think it's no longer the case. I've worked now with a
That's
number
a very
of
good line.
economists.
Very good line.
Say again, Glenn?
I said it's very hard to explain something to somebody when his livelihood depends on not getting it is a very good line.
Beautiful, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Classic Tversky. Yeah. Beautiful. But but since then I've worked with lots. I've collaborated with a number of wonderful economists who don't seem to be threatened by that. I mean, both kind of the older school like Peter Diamond or Hank Farber and Dick Thaler, and some younger people, all of whom are open to revisions and kinks and how to think about challenges that are not subsumed by the standard thinking. And I think more and more people, certainly the younger generation, but I think most people, many economists, are sort of open to the fact that there is some wisdom and need to revise. So I think the old version kind of threat to the industry, I think to some extent is less salient today, I think, in these collaborations. Don't you think?
Yeah, no, I definitely do. I think economics has changed amazingly as a community of investigators.
And good for them. I mean, that's impressive.
Since I was in graduate school, yeah, and it's very much less focused on this high theoretical project, which was, nested within a certain set of assumptions about behavior, but perhaps didn't intersect with actual human behavior and its observation very much. A lot of applied, I can't tell you anything about this. I'm sure, applied economists running around the world doing all kinds of field experiments and quasi-experiments and things like that, trying to measure and test. And behavioral economics, which your work could be regarded as an instance, but of which there are many other examples, and is progressively coming into its own. I mean, what it will all add up to at the end of the day, I think it may be hard to say right now, but that's okay. I mean, I think.
Yeah, I think, we'll have sophisticated social science. I mean, I think, the stuff you're describing from Goffman, the stuff that Kathy Eden is doing a lot of other places.
Yeah.
The people we met when we were at Harvard recently.
Yeah.
These are all contributing to a beautiful set of issues that are seen from, multiple perspectives and, seem to yield some rich and interesting challenges and results. Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So I've been thinking a lot of late about, financial meltdowns, bubbles. Maybe it was this recent Nobel Prize in economics that went to Eugene Fama and Robert Shiller and the econometrician at Chicago, whose name escapes me. I'm sorry.
Excellent. Yeah.
At the moment, it may come to me yet. But in any case, Fama doesn't believe in bubbles. He thinks financial markets are efficient and that, everything in long run equilibrium, all the information is going to get reflected and so forth, the efficient market hypothesis. And Schiller has more of a behavioral, coloration to his observations. And there are huge implications for how you think. And this is really a more general intellectual question that I want to raise, a scientific question. You guys are doing micro-analysis in the sense that you're studying the behavior of individuals in certain circumstances. But there's a question of equilibrium analysis, kind of macro. I don't mean macro in terms of unemployment and inflation. I mean macro in terms of the aggregative implications of a system in which individuals behave in a particular way. And a financial market is, of course, one such system. I don't mean to get you speculating outside the area of your expertise, but I'm just curious whether in this series of investigations that you guys have been doing, you've seen any connections between the behavioral implications of scarcity on the one hand, and various otherwise difficult to explain aggregative economic phenomena like, financial collapses and things like that. And if this is a stretch, then we can just ignore the question and move on to something else. But that's what I was thinking about.
Well, it is outside my boundary. It seems to be that, the recent crisis to which the housing market contributed some proportion of which came from individual buyers. I don't know exactly how to analyze all of that. But
Yeah.
there's no doubt that people, who bought ballooning mortgages of all sorts and thought they could do all kinds of things they couldn't do, it's not unlinked to a fundamental lack of full understanding, distraction, wishful thinking, the kind of stuff that led people to do things they shouldn't have done. And of course, similar issues come from the other side, from the bankers. But there's a lot of profound misgauging of where things are that seems to have contributed to things. We in a provocative passage in the book talk about the fact that if you take seriously the idea that budgetary concerns, impose on your bandwidth and make you a little bit less smart, if you take that seriously, you could argue that during the recession, the nation got less smart. Tens of millions of people became more preoccupied with their budget, had less bandwidth to dedicate to other things, and we just walk. If you take this research seriously, we're walking in the street just a little bit, a few IQ points lower. And if you do this to 100, 150 million Americans, that might be detected in some kind of a macro level.
I guess I invited that kind of speculation, so I shouldn't complain about it. But here's the kind of thing that I was thinking about, and I don't know if it's crazy or not, but I was thinking, say that I'm an advertiser and I'm trying to sell something. And I know that people have these lacunae or these glitches in their thinking, or that under certain circumstances, they'll be oriented in a particular way. They won't be paying attention to the bottom line as much. They'll be more worried about dealing with the immediate crisis of limited whatever. And I want to exploit that because I'm in the business of making profits on people. Well, maybe the government would be serving the population well by limiting the ability and to advertise in particular settings, or by providing information and warnings to people. Before you make this choice, be aware of the fact that whatever. I once almost bought one of these timeshares that you never use and that you can't sell.
Yeah.
One of these things that they want you to spend $150,000 or $200,000 on, and at the end of the day, you really wish that you hadn't done it, and you can't get out. And I almost bought it. I signed the contract, but there was a provision in the law that allowed me to, renege within 72 hours of having signed the contract when I came to my senses. And I'm so glad that provision in the law was there. Anyway, you see what I'm getting at.
This is a distinguished economist getting that close. Imagine a person on the street.
I'm telling you.
Yeah. Of course. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Look, advertising is a beautiful example. Here is a simple, funny thing. Subliminal advertising is illegal in this country.
Yeah.
That's a little bit like making illegal using your hands in a cell phone in the car. Everybody knows the hands are irrelevant. But you can't convince policymakers that the phone is a problem, so you convince them the hand is a problem, and you get halfway.
I get it.
Subliminal advertising is the same thing. It doesn't have to be subliminal. There's 1,000 studies. I can show you the thing, and if you think you can control your reaction, if you think you can decipher what it's doing to you and resist it, you're wrong. So the subliminal is really an uninteresting detail. Advertising does things to us that even if we know it's happening, we cannot fully control. And yes, to the extent that it's making us do bad things, you could argue that a well-functioning, well-informed, behaviorally sophisticated government, organizations, or cities ought to think carefully about what to do about that. It's actually interesting. If you look at work on influence, for many years, behavioral scientists have distinguished between two ways to get to you. I can get to you through central routes, namely, I present a coherent and careful argument, which you then parse and think about and decide whether you're convinced or not. Or I can go peripherally. As you're busy doing something, I just put a poster of a lovely person on a horse smoking a cigarette, and you now have an urge to grab a cigarette. This is a kind of advertising where you don't think it carefully, you just kind of are impacted peripherally without even noticing it. Now, what's interesting is there's some kinds of arguments that are very hard to do with a person on a horse. I have to give you a very careful argument. For example, savings for retirement. I can't create an urge to save for retirement by giving you a sunset on a poster. I have to explain it carefully.
Yeah.
Cigarettes, alcohol, sodas are the opposite. I don't want you to think about it carefully, because if you think about it carefully, you know that cigarettes are not good for you. But a beautiful poster might work. Now, it turns out that when you're cognitively overwhelmed, when you're parsing a lot and have very little bandwidth left, Central route is very hard to reach you because you don't have any left. Peripheral route is easy. And so what that suggests is if you are very, very busy, if you are struggling poor, there is no time to give you lectures about retirement savings, but it's really easy to flash posters of alcohol and cigarettes and other things on the walls. And so even there, in some sense, it's exactly those who are overwhelmed and handicapped who will be most prone to suggestion and to influence from the sort of things that you wish they had more cognitive bandwidth to resist.
Yeah, this is so fascinating. I know your time is limited. I just had one other thought here. Your time is limited this afternoon, and your time is limited in general, as we've been analyzing. And the thought has to do with political communication, Eldar. It has to do with campaigns, a special kind of advertising in which political candidates and parties try to appeal around election time for people to behave in a particular way when they go into the voting booth.
Right.
And the things that might quickly grab voters' attention or move them or cause them to their behavior to change versus the things that are of deep significance to the country, whether it's its role in the world or how it wants to order its domestic institutions or whatever it might be. And it might be much easier to get people's juices flowing or to cause them to vote this way or that if I tell them that something emotive, about a social issue or something is going on, or if I characterize the opponents in demon terms, or if the election is taking place on a fixed date without the capacity for people to choose for some extended period of electioneering when it is that they might want to send their ballot in. So the campaign communication framework has a particular temporal structure to it that people can exploit by backloading the money for a ton of ads on the weekend before the election or something like that. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, okay? And neither one of us are political scientists, but I'm just saying perhaps there's a rich vein to mine in thinking about institutional design in light of the behavioral implications of scarcity, and the political realm would be one target-rich environment, I think, for that kind of speculation.
That sounds right to me. I mean, obviously, we're getting into an area where those who have the most capacity to have influence are those least interested in doing so. So we have a problem.
Right.
But I think that's absolutely right. I mean, you have a population that's overwhelmed and distracted and processing things very superficially.
Indeed.
By the way, we didn't mention one thing that's at least worth leaving before we leave.
Very good.
When we talk about the poor managing the budgets, the experiments we're doing, in the mall and other places, these are not people who are living in abject poverty. These are people in New Jersey who basically, drove to the mall that day. These are basically 100, 150 million Americans. You don't have to be poor. You just have to be budget constrained at the level where when it's brought up, you're overwhelmed and distracted by it. And so you have a population, half or two-thirds of which is, overwhelmed and distracted between money and time. And yes, all the political messaging, all the other things you do are often, the model is not built on people who have no capacity to attend and to process. And that makes a big difference. I agree.
Listen, thank you so much, Eldar Shafir, Professor of Psychology, Princeton, for coming on and talking about your new book, Scarcity, Why Having Too Little Means So Much, jointly authored with Sindel Mullainathan. I really appreciate you giving us your time.
Great talking to you, Brad.
Okay, bye.